Right, well, hello, good evening, and welcome everybody to the second live question and answer session of this term's Geography for Schools lecture series, brought to you by the Department of Geography here at Royal Holloway. And I am absolutely delighted this evening to be joined by Professor Pete Adey, who is a human and cultural geographer at Royal Holloway. And I'll ask Pete to introduce himself to you in just a second. So Pete, I think everybody here will have had a chance to see your Air Mobilities lecture from last week. And thank you very much for sharing that. I should also just say right from the outset that alongside each of these lectures, there's a whole series of teaching resources that our colleagues are putting together and that are being hosted on the Royal Holloway Geography Teachers Hub. And that's a really fantastic collection of resources with summaries for you to use in the classroom. They contain activities that you might want to use with your students, or students, if you are involved in independent learning, you can download those and just engage with those yourself. And if you want to find out more about that, you can log on to www.rhul.ac.uk /geography and just navigate to the Teachers Hub through our webpage, where you can find all of those resources. So Pete, as I say, welcome to you this evening. Thank you for joining us. What I traditionally ask people to do at the start of these sessions is just to give us a little bit of a resume of what you were talking about in the main part of your lecture, which of course was last week. So if people want to see the whole thing, then they can go onto our YouTube page or onto Facebook and see the whole thing. But perhaps you could offer us a little bit of a summary just by way of introduction.
Hi, yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Hearing you loud and clear.
Brilliant. So in the video, I guess I divided it up into 5 or 6 kind of key themes, if you like. And the first one was about dealing with sort of why put mobilities in front of air travel, kind of why is that a significant word or thing to do? And maybe it's not so straightforward. So by mobilities, we're trying to say that when we're thinking about travel, when we're thinking about transport, we mean more than quite there's a tendency to think about transport as being a kind of line on a map, a movement from kind of one place to another. What within the field has quite famously been put as a line from A to B. And within the field I work within, we might call that as being movement, quite a kind of functional, abstract movement from one place to another. Why we put mobility in front of air travel or transport is that we're trying to say that movement is more than just moving from one place to another. We're trying to say that movement is bound up in meaning and significance. So that movement from one place to another, it means something to the person doing it, to someone else. That movement might be economically productive. It might have a social meaning. It might be performing a particular kind of social function to fulfill a family obligation, to get to work. It's also something that is experienced. So we feel movement in different kinds of ways. When we're talking about mobility, we also think critically that we don't all have the same access to mobility either. So while that line from A to B kind of implies equality, or we don't see lots of different lines, we just see one thick line. And what mobility tries to do is it thinks about mobility in a plural sense. So it says, well, when we're moving, we're often moving with others, and we're not always moving in the same way. And in fact, maybe some people can't move. Maybe some people are more immobile, or maybe some people can't experience the same mobility as I can. And indeed, my mobility or your mobility might affect someone else's mobility in a positive way or in a negative way. So mobility kind of comes with some of this baggage, if you like, of much deeper ways of understanding and thinking about travel and transport. The next sort of parts of the session try to dig into air travel mobilities in a bit more depth. And the first way we do that is to explore, well, our sort of system of air travel today hasn't just sort of come out of nowhere. It comes from somewhere. And what I try to do at the start of the session is to say, well, the kind of origins of air travel and aviation mobilities come from particular nations, particular nation states. We could see them as part of development projects, but also colonial projects. So I sort of spend a little bit of the time kind of tracing some of Britain's experience of imperial aviation. And I also suggest that it's difficult to separate aviation from conflict as well, although there's not much time to do this in the session. So we talk a little bit about the kind of emergence of aviation or civilian air travel for trade and for business and for travel and for leisure, kind of happened hand in hand with the development of aviation for war. So for the bomber or the fighter plane kind of happened at the same time, and they sort of pushed each other along. And maybe the sort of third thing to say about this, sort of where they come from, is that aviation, air travel, mobilities, and of course airlines and airports are often bound up in state national projects of prestige. So to have an air travel network or system, or to have built an airport, especially in the early years of aviation, was a significant enterprise. And it was often airlines come to kind of capture and mirror some of the sort of often stereotype characteristics of a nation, and often countries have used airlines to sort of reflect the nation back at themselves. So there's some interesting kind of social, political, and cultural and economic ties that we can connect to air transport. And then I suppose the next couple of parts just sort of dig into the infrastructure of the aviation. So we spend a little bit of time looking at the airport and wondering about the airport as a kind of infrastructure, if you like, that has been really important. It is really important to the city. Often there's a lot of work to try to think about airports as cities, and there's a really important drivers of economic activity. And we also then thought about what actually happens inside the airport, maybe an experience that most of us or some of us can relate to, which is to sort of wonder about these sort of strange places. And there's a little exercise in in one of the activities. And in the session, I sort of asked the question, kind of what kind of place is an airport? Why do they feel different? Why do they seem similar to other places I've been or to other airports I might go to? And what other ways are there that airports work quite hard to connect themselves to particular places? So there's an interesting tension around airports as being these sort of sites of connection or interdependency, being related to other places, being then familiar and similar to other places for lots of reasons, but also then airports working quite hard to make them feel distinctive and individual and attractive. And then just at the end then, we thought about then what are the kind of key challenges that are affecting air travel today. And we've obviously been living through an extreme challenge to air travel. As I begin the session, the COVID pandemic has had a massive effect on air travel, completely upended the industry. Whilst at the same time, we've just gone through the 20th anniversary to September the 11th. Of course, there are other kinds of threats, other kinds of challenges to air travel. And we look at the kind of double-edged sword, if you like, of the threats to aviation from terrorism, but also the threats to aviation from the very practices that we use to secure it, from security. And then we look at disruption. I try to position other disruptions in the context of the pandemic. Air travel is disrupted all of the time. Air travel, of course, is embedded within our systems of life. So when air travel is disrupted, our ways of life are often disrupted. And then finally, we think about and sort of mention, without really having enough time to go into too much detail on it, kind of what kind of challenge climate change is posing to air travel. And that's kind of where we get to.
Pete, brilliant. Thank you for that fantastic summary. I watched the lecture just before this, so it was fresh in my mind, but that'll be a helpful reminder for everybody else that watched it last week, if nothing else. Pete, I think what I'd first of all like to just ask you is how you happened to get into this area of research in the first place. What was it about? Was it about air travel? Was it about mobility more generally that got you into this particular area of geographical research?
Oh, yeah, thanks. And I don't want to kind of go too far down memory lane and kind of thinking about this, but inevitably you kind of have to. But I think there was sort of a kind of convergence of several events really sort of shook my interest in air travel. But I suppose, talking about the 20th anniversary of 9/11, that to me was one of the kind of shaking moments. And it happened a year after I'd been on a geography field trip to New York. And so I had these sort of two experiences of air travel, one being in an airport with a group of students on the way to New York on a geography field trip, just kind of wondering about, I guess, through a geography degree, being really attuned to particular spaces and places, and to think about the airport in the context of these kind of massive global networks of movement of people and capital and goods and commodities, and being stuck, not stuck, but waiting in an airport, getting a bit bored, wondering kind of why we're dwelling in this sort of shopping center for such a long time, encountering in really interesting kind of visual symbols of states and nations and flags and presidents' faces on the wall, seeing kind of global brands and signs and symbols kind of all around us, and just wondering about what kind of place this is. It doesn't feel like, it feels a bit like a city. It feels a bit like the other airports we left on our way to New York. So kind of on the one hand, kind of wondering about this peculiar place through this sort of very geographical way of thinking, and then on the other hand, then a year later, reflecting on 9/11 as aircraft, obviously plow into the World Trade Center, its two towers and other buildings, and just being, I guess, kind of witnessing the fragility of our urban structures around us, obviously in moments of extreme violence. And then, one of the obviously the outcomes of 9/11, well, obviously was being so huge, but one of the immediate outcomes was then just the stoppage of aviation. So it sort of symbolized both the sort of fragility of our systems and our ways of life, particular ways of life in particular places and particular buildings, which have their own history and geography, to high-rise buildings and cities that have been at threat from aviation for a very long time, not just from 9/11. Of course, the World Trade Center had been bombed in '93 previously, and it had been warned that could happen. Whilst at the same time, you also see the fragility of this system of we in the session I talk about how many people are in the air at one time, or the kind of the global numbers of air travel or flights and passenger flights that we have to think of. And in that one moment, in the United States, all of the planes, well, unless you've seen the 9/11 documentaries, military planes and Air Force One, apart from those planes, everyone was grounded. So it's just amazing, I guess, sort of, sense of fragility to a system that had seemed so sure. And also, I think, an experience of air travel that had been previously to me about freedom and about travel and exploration, and a very privileged form of seeing the world, and yet that became so fragile in a moment.
Pete, that's really fascinating to hear that kind of, well, I was going to say ground zero for your own interest in this area. You also mentioned, just slightly in passing in the lecture, something about Liverpool Airport, which was obviously somewhere that was quite important to you during your PhD research, because you described the way that airport, now a much bigger, and of course John Lennon Airport, started off as, I think you said it was a farmer's field, and the original air traffic control tower was the upstairs window of one of the sheds. Do you want to say a little bit more about, how did you then pivot from this interest in the fragility of particular infrastructures as prompted by the events of 9/11 to then thinking about somewhere like Liverpool Airport?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is a dangerous question because I could talk about this for a very long time. I don't know, you don't want me to, but I will try to be precise.
Briefly.
Yeah, I will briefly. So it was about the kind of so if partly my the experience I gave you of kind of going on a geography field trip to New York and being bemused and kind of wondering at this strange place was about an experience, I guess a kind of globalized experience, that we felt this almost frictionless movement from one place to another in a kind of capsule where we're sort of looked after, and we're distracted by films, and then we're arriving in this commodity mall place of an airport. It's an experience of being, places being brought closer together, what we might call time-space compression, and experiencing movement at extreme speeds, but in a lot of luxury, and feeling of almost being detached, if you like, so that being kind of whipped from one place to another at speed, with almost no physical exertion whatsoever, being routed through this kind of fast corridor of travel. Some people call that type of experience, and those who do it, the kinetic elite. And it's almost a kind of experience of that, moving incredibly quickly and being quite privileged in being able to do so. The reason to look at Liverpool was to say, well, of course, these massive infrastructures that we know as airports, they're attached. And my experience of kind of being shuttling through them relatively quickly, albeit pausing for a moment and being a bit bored with an airport terminal, is to sort of completely forget that these places, that these airports and the infrastructures around them are somewhere. And so one of the reasons why I kind of looked at Liverpool and I thought about its geography and its history as being entwined, part of my research was quite historical and geographical at the same time, was to explore kind of, well, where have these places come from? They don't just exist anywhere. They exist in certain places in relation to cities. In Liverpool, is in relation to its port. The progress of the airport was bound up in what the city leaders thought about as the future of its port would be in the air, not necessarily in sea travel, in the 1920s and 1930s, when they were wondering about building an airport. And so partly it was about kind of trying to see how are airports and aviation attached to particular places, and why are they attached to particular places, and what does that mean? And the Liverpool Airport was really bound up in Liverpool's national identity. It was about seeing its progress, as I said, kind of in the air. Its future was in the air. Lots of kind of newspaper headlines from city leaders and officials that sort of really emphasized the city's place as kind of a connection point node, if you like, within a network of movement, of within trade and passengers. And so the reason why I got into Liverpool was to try to really sort of think about the airports and explore the empirically and historically the airport's connections to a particular place, to its culture, to the locality. And it's very difficult to separate the development of an airport like Liverpool from, I don't know, it's quite a superficial thing, but the renaming of the airport to John Lennon Airport was that, trying to make that explicit connection between these places that feel globalized, they feel of somewhere else, is an effort to really draw them back to belong in a particular place, even if that's a relatively superficial naming. I mean, there are lots of other kind of, there's the statues and the yellow submarine sculpture outside. There are lots of other ways that the airport is kind of brought back to its locality, and of course thousands of people work there and live around the airport. There's a Friends of Liverpool Airport community society that is invested and interested in the airport. So I could go on, but it's about that kind of local connection, I suppose, that I was trying to explore.
Pete, thank you so much for that. And actually, as you were talking, we had a question that has come in from one of our viewers. And I'm just going to experiment bringing this up on screen. So it's a question from Isabel, who asks, well, first of all, says hello to you both, and we say hello back to you, Isabel. I was wondering what both of your thoughts, well, I'm completely irrelevant here, so let's just ask Pete, shall we, are on the idea of an airport as a sort of in-between space that is both governed by the country the airport is based in geographically, and perhaps representing the country the airport is based in on a particular way, but also as a transitionary space. So it struck me that given that previous answer that you were just given, Pete, this was maybe quite a good time to ask this question, because I think one of the things I was getting a sense of from your talk are sometimes the kind of contradictions that exist in the airport. On one hand, they work very hard to be global and to be quite homogenous as an experience goes. But then on the other hand, there are many airports, including Liverpool, including, for example, Changi in Singapore, that are working very hard to be individual and to kind of represent something about the place that they are from. So on one hand, global, international, and homogenous. On the other hand, very particular kinds of places. And I think Isabel's question gets to that. Are these, how are they in between places or in between spaces? Are they places in themselves? But how also might we think of them as transitionary kinds of spaces?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Isabel. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I think sometimes we talk about in-between spaces being liminal spaces. They're kind of they're on the threshold of something. And I mean, you can think about the airport as being on the threshold of lots of things, and they're very, very geographical. You think between earth and sky, the airport is a kind of mediating space between, how we get airborne for a short or a very long period. And an airport, it sort of has somewhere sort of a kind of horizontal, vertical geography, if you like, that the airport stitches us between. And I mean, and in some respects, maybe that geography is a little bit overlooked in the work that airports do to sort of prepare us to go airborne. They do lots of things to our body. I talked about this a long time ago, as the airport is a kind of difference machine, because one of the things that airports do is that as they sort of prepare us for flight, is that they sort of change us as bodies and as subjects. And they do that through technologies, and they do that through like kind of architecture to some extent. They do that through the way that we interact with agents that handle us and our baggage in certain ways, and they prepare us for flight. And some of that is about logistics, so we kind of separate passengers from their luggage, and we do that for certain kind of efficiency reasons. We also do that for security reasons. We also separate passengers from their things, sometimes even their clothing, virtually, as passengers pass through security. And depending on the kind of the airport, the system you're traveling through, the surface of your clothing may well be peered beneath. Certainly our information is being sorted and surveilled in different ways, sometimes in advance of our flight, as we're booking our airline ticket, or a few days before we take a flight, we might submit passport information that will be checked and transmitted depending on where you're traveling to. So there's a certain amount of kind of preparation. There's also kind of transport conversion that's going on. The airport is this kind of interface between ground and sky. You may well be moving off from different modes of transport, from car, taxi, from train, from bus. And an airport, in a kind of transport geography terms, is a kind of multimodal interchange. So it's moving you from different modes of mobility into a form, into a package, if you like, that gets you to puts you on the plane in an efficient way, tries to extract some revenue from you whilst you're waiting in the airport. That's a lot of airports raise revenue from shopping, and those dwell times that you spend in an airport are really important for them to extract some of that revenue from you. And then you get put on an airplane. So that kind of that sort of interstitial, liminal, in between sort of space is kind of about preparing. But there are other ways that kind of interspace is important in the sense of other kinds of practices around security and around immigration. So when we arrive at an airport, in terms of kind of the sort of legalities of arrival, until we pass through the immigration checkpoint, we haven't really arrived. So when you're in arrivals, or before you get through arrivals and you're at the border guard, you're at checking your passport, you haven't yet arrived. And so, and some people may not have the right to arrive. Some people's rights may be challenged and judged and scrutinized in different ways. And some people are turned back. Some people may be held in an airport as they're waiting for a decision on their arrival to be made. There are kind of, within some airports, there are hotels and holding spaces where people are made to wait. So I think this kind of notion of the sort of the in-between has a lot of different meanings. I mean, I'll stop in a minute. Another meaning you might think about is the airport as this sort of threshold, not just to a country, an entry to a country. And we often think about airports in those ways, but the airport as a kind of gate, if you like, a gateway, not just to the nation, but often we talk about them as kind of gateways to cities, perhaps. Many airports, we might think about them as cities, but they often sit on the threshold of cities as well. And so some of that thresholding work does something to mobility. It's about filtering, sorting, preparing. It's a very active, liminal, in-between space, I think.
That is really helpful, and certainly you've beautifully illustrated that question about airports as transitionary for all kinds of reasons, modes of transport, preparing one's body for entering the air. But I think one of the things that Isabel's question was also interested in is this idea of governance, and you did touch on that, because one of the things that airports do is they check whether our bodies are airworthy in terms of security, for example. And I know that particularly after 9/11, which is one of the things that you talk about at length in your lecture, of course, the governance of airports and the governance of air travel became far stricter than it had been before. And that smoothness of experience that had been, I think, really integral to the growing popularity of flight during the 60s and 70s and 80s became rather rougher at the edges. That it became a bit more difficult to fly because of the changing governance rules. And I think Isabel's question again gets to that, because on one hand, these spaces do seem can seem remarkably slick and transitionary, but there's also governance here as well. And could you just say a little bit more about where does that governance come from? Is that are there international rules of flight, or are these things governed very much nationally?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's both. Yeah, so there are big international aviation authorities, IATA and ICAO, set international standards around safety and around security practices and measures that I guess try to sort of standardize the kind of practices that govern or shape our experience of travel in the air and within the airport. But they're also hugely dependent upon national states adhering to those kinds of practices and regulations, and sometimes developing their own and sometimes acting in quite interesting ways. So that, yeah, what you saw post 9/11 was a in concert attempt to ramp up aviation security that followed. I mean, it's not like we didn't have practices of aviation security before 9/11. I think that kind of my experience that I counted at the start of a almost romantic idea of going on a geography field trip, I think it's filtered through my memories of that as well. Of course, there were aviation security practices that had been around for a long time. International aviation terrorism, or the types of terrorism that have affected aviation, have been around since the 60s and 70s, and which were around the involved bombings and hijackings of aircraft, particularly Israeli aircraft and its airline El Al. There was the Libyan bombing, Lockerbie Pan Am bombing in 1988, and those kinds of events meant that the public, particularly the UK, the British public, to just contextualize this a bit, were practices of security were relatively familiar in the context of kind of those sort of archway metal detector, really quite mundane practices of security we're talking about here, that are about trying to make aviation safe by kind of filtering out metallic metals, mostly firearms particularly, from aircraft. But one of the things that 9/11 brought about was a sort of wholesale ramping up of whole different layers of governance that were about data sharing between countries, but particularly between the European Union and the United States, and a lot of debates about pushing data from one jurisdiction to another, so that the US was kind of demanding that EU airlines were pushing passenger name record data, so containing information about passengers that is contained on databases to the United States before passengers would arrive there, so they could make judgments. They develop things called no-fly watch lists, so they would create lists of suspected passengers or passengers of concern, and they would check that against the information that was being transmitted to them. I mean, at a much more physical level, most of us who've traveled internationally, at least, have become relatively used to these wave millimeter technologies that are effectively a kind of full body X-ray. They used to use X-ray technology, X-ray backscatter technology, until they realized that those were unsafe, and so then they moved to wave millimeter scanners, and they're literally about looking beneath the clothing of the body, with huge implications for these sorts of practices. And I think that's the other thing Isabel's question of governance gets at, is that there is a tendency to think about aviation as a kind of exceptional space where extreme things can happen, therefore we need to use the most extreme measures of governance and security to secure them. But one of the outcomes of that has led to very intrusive forms of security or surveillance, both from a kind of personal information point of view to a kind of bodily integrity point of view, with all the kinds of concerns that looking beneath the skin has for different communities within society, as well as the concern that we're not all being treated fairly as we move by air. And those are much older concerns than 9/11, but certainly one of the things that 9/11 intensified was the scrutiny and suspicion, particularly of non-white bodies.
Yeah. I mean, that of course was really controversial, wasn't it, in the years after 9/11, the idea of screening and
passenger profiling as
passenger profiling. Yeah, absolutely. Pete, I'm conscious of time, and we could talk at length about these issues, but I think one of the things that people will have really enjoyed about the lecture is thinking about airlines and indeed airports as somehow representative of the states that they belong to, because of course many airlines in the past were created by and were kind of reflective of nation states. And I mean, one of the things that I'm quite acutely aware of, because I've just marked a PhD actually about the history of Air Cyprus and Cyprus Airways. And in the same week, I think that Alitalia is having its last ever flight. Perhaps those national airlines, which of course were foundational in terms of opening up flight, are somewhat in retreat, arguably, and new kinds of airlines are emerging. But could you just say a little bit more about that connection that you were trying to draw between the nation state and national carriers, and perhaps how national carriers reflect somehow the personality that people often associate with particular states?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't want to be too parochial, but we're kind of talking about this obviously in the context of Britain, so it's hard not to think about British Airways. And I think, as I said I think I said this in the session, that we used to talk about airlines as being flag carriers because they held the national flags on their tails. So the Union Jack is on British Airways, and so there was a sense that, I mean, they're all kind of sort of complex national economic disputes about where airlines could go that weren't settled, that took a long time to be settled. There's a lot of concerns about, in fact, we've been talking about this a bit in the context of using overseas logistics trucking companies in Britain just in the last couple of weeks. And there was concerns about this around air travel in its earlier years, about is it right? Is it going to deprive British jobs and industries if we allow overseas airlines to kind of invade Britain and fly our passengers somewhere else? So there's kind of, I don't know, kind of economic sort of ties to national identity, but particularly it was about, think about the sorts of things that aviation has symbolized for a very long time, even if it's become everyday, or it had become everyday until COVID. And then at the same time, even when we say it's become everyday, we also need to recognize that we don't all fly. And there's a lot of statistics that show just how uneven passenger flight is, where the kind of small proportion of, I think in the UK, maybe 20% of it's the 15 or 20% that fly the most, that take the 70 or 80% of seats. So it's still very much an experience that is mostly for the wealthy who just simply fly a lot. Even if it has become a mass passenger experience that has become much cheaper. I mean, one of the things challenging those flag carrying airlines has been the growth of low cost air travel in the UK, in the context of EasyJet and Ryanair become enormous players internationally as well as nationally. But it's that kind of tying together of the sorts of things that aviation meant, and maybe still means a little bit, about kind of reach. You think about those very geographical things are moving across space. The airline maps that airline companies used to produce show a kind of crawling map of flight routes across the world, and so they express state and national ambitions to kind of reach across space, to communicate, to trade, maybe to extract, to bring back wealth and riches. So there's those kind of things, and there's the sort of the technological pursuits as well, that air travel. I mean, we could talk about innovation that's often associated with air travel, but air travel has often been at the kind of edge of technological innovation. Aircraft costs a lot of money. The infrastructure to support them costs a lot of money. And so there is a pride and prestige that goes with an airline being tied to a nation, a national carrier. And the same goes for airports as well. You think about particularly in the UK, again, kind of London Heathrow, is being seen as a sort of jewel, if you like, of Britain's airports, as seen as a gateway to the UK. And when things go wrong, it's a national embarrassment. And those sorts of narratives have come up around COVID and the kind of delays, and the sort of inhospitability of the airport welcoming people to the country. I'm drawn back to kind of when Terminal 5 opened, and its baggage system, this kind of vaunted, hugely technologically complicated baggage system, failed so problematically during the first few weeks of Terminal 5's opening at Heathrow, and it was on all the newspapers as a kind of national disgrace and national embarrassment. So some of those sort of national tethers have not completely left us, even if the national the flag carrying airline maybe is on its way out.
I remember a Monty Python song called I'm Worried About, and one of the things they're worried about is the baggage retrieval system at Heathrow Airport. So it's even made it into Monty Python. It must be of significance. But Pete, I'm just want to pick up on one point there before we move on to the final question I have for you, and that's this idea of the map, with these spreading out routes as being a real sense of kind of geopolitical power, and that that countries and airports that are highly densely connected has been, as you say, a sign of kind of geopolitical, political, diplomatic, commercial, economic, cultural prestige. But of course, during COVID, that flight pattern also became effectively a map of vulnerability and risk. And this is what I want to kind of move on to in that last section, and that's this idea of future challenges. And of course, COVID has provoked considerable challenge, but then so also does climate change provoke considerable challenge for the future of the air industry and air mobilities, because we're all being asked individually, aren't we, to contemplate our own personal air travel far more than we ever have before. So with that in mind, what is the future of air travel, particularly given that we are all being asked to think ethically about whether we should fly?
That is such a good question, and there's obviously only a very complicated and very partial response to such a complicated question. I mean, part of the futures has been kind of quite surprising and worrying, in the sense that I think I mentioned this in the video, that, and this was seen, you could see this in the even in the early periods of kind of recovery from the first months of COVID, that private jet travel was really shooting back up. It suffered similar to sort of a similar kind of decline as passenger travel did, but then it rebounded incredibly quickly, almost back to the levels it was before the pandemic. And you could see that there were some reasons for that around, well, private jet travel offered a level of kind of biosecurity and safety that passenger travel wouldn't, and it could be, you could control who's around you, and the methods of booking and getting on a private jet are very different to passenger travel. So the kind of restrictions weren't the same. So in one sense, that form of travel was easier, and it's not in unsurprising ways. But in other ways, it seems counterintuitive to all of the kind of demands that you've mentioned around climate change, and obviously private jet travel is also far less efficient than traveling on a full commercial airline. So I think that's one of the really worrying responses, that there has been this growth in private jet travel. For even if you see the high profile figures and businesses talking the talk about wanting to cut their carbon emissions and to travel more sustainably, there is still a huge amount of interest and demand for that kind of travel. It doesn't seem to be going away. So there are those kind of things on the one hand that
Peter, I know this all too well, because you and I obviously work at Royal Holloway Airport. Sorry, we don't work at Royal Holloway Airport. We work at Royal Holloway, which is in the lee of Heathrow. And there, when I did go in, it was silent because there were so few flights. At home, I live very close to the flight path of Farnborough Airport, which of course is, I think, the busiest private airport particularly for private jet use in the country. And there has been an incredible surge of private flights taking off and landing at Farnborough Airport over the past year. So I can see it. I could probably map it from my front window.
But I wonder if that inequality, that really sharp differentiation, is where we're going. That's what we've seen. Maybe the COVID pandemic intensifies those differences that I pointed out earlier, that where our access to air travel mobilities is uneven, and it depends a great deal on who we are, what passport we hold, our wealth, our resources, not just in terms of capital, but maybe in time, our obligations, what part of the world we're traveling from. And the COVID pandemic perhaps has kind of intensified some of those things, made them more visible in some ways, and in other ways maybe not so much. I think the other side to the question is, what are the sort of alternatives to air travel mobilities? And maybe that's one of the biggest issues in that. I think there are issues about the ways that we as individuals are sort of responsibilized to make the best decisions. At the same time, there are competing pulls on us to trade and to communicate and to travel, to spend money on holiday. I think there are so many tensions, just in the ways we were talking about tensions earlier. There are other tensions around, if we diminish air travel, how do we really do that? There are big pushes among academics to not fly to conferences anymore, and that's doable for some people in the world. For other people in the world that are more remote, that are further away from kind of networks of academic and scholarly community, that would really hamper them in terms of their careers and their ability to exchange knowledge and collaborate with other people. Academia is clearly a kind of warped microcosm of the rest of society, but it says something about that if we think about flying less, it's obviously obvious that we have to do that, but at the same time, how do we do that in a way that is fair, or in a way that we understand the social, political, economic, cultural outcomes of doing that? And if we move to other forms of mobility, we have to think carefully about what they come with. And I think I made this a bit glib point within the video, that an alternative to an international transatlantic journey is a much slower one, perhaps, and which is great, but how accessible, maybe that is our future. But in terms of how we transition to that, we still live within the societies that value speed and interconnectivity, and our lives and our social relations and our networks and our work depend upon that speed and interconnectivity and interdependency. So there are some of us may be able to do that, and some of us might not. And that perhaps is one of the biggest kinds of challenges.
I think that's really interesting, Peter, and a very a very poignant moment, I think, to end on, just contemplating, I think, an air industry that freed up people to travel from the 1960s to the 1990s and 2000s in increasing numbers. Perhaps what we're looking at now is the return to that kinetic elite that you referred to before, where some people can afford to travel and other people won't be for whatever reason, or will choose not to be for ethical or indeed moral reasons. And we haven't even talked about commercial or freight travel so far. But I think at 45 minutes, I think we better draw it to an end. With huge thanks to you, Pete, for frankly just being the fascinating person that you are, and for those insights. Let me also just highlight a few final things for people. This, of course, is all part of the Geography for Schools lecture series. And in the weeks ahead, we have 2 more talks coming up. On the 1st of November, we've got Catchment Hydrology with Don Thompson. So that's all about environmental change, flood hazard, and management in 21st century Britain. So the lecture will be on the 1st, and the Q&A will be on the 7th. And then Phil Krang will be talking about the world on a plate, culinary connections, globalization, and changing places. That's on the 15th of November, with the Q&A on the 22nd of November, all Mondays. And Pete, just one final thanks from me, and on behalf of everybody else who's joined us and the people who've been asking questions, thank you. And that was just really fascinating. And as I said right at the start, Pete's talk, the Q&A, and the teaching resources that he has prepared with activities can all be found on the Royal Holloway Geography Teachers Hub. So Pete, thank you again once more.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everybody.